This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 236, entitled Masculist Murderous Hatred of Feminazi Divorce Court Judges and Lawyers. Description. This flyer guesstimates that hundreds of feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers are murdered each year in the US by the ex-husbands they financially massacre and whose lives they destroy. That is, tens of millions of men over the decades. This flyer predicts that as masculist ideas spread, divorcing men will develop such a hatred against these feminazi butchers that the murder rate against them will rise to thousands per year in the sex war, until the gender laws, especially the divorce laws, are menfaired. The flyer itself. Masculist Murderous Hatred of Feminazi Divorce Court Judges and Lawyers by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. A sex war is brewing. There's growing murderous hatred coming from the masculists against the feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers. It's only a question of time before these feminazis and male feminist traitors are murdered in their thousands by divorced men whose lives have been destroyed by these feminazi butchers. Take the case of two divorcing fathers. One is a typical unenlightened man-slave who has been brainwashed all his life that his role is to work for a woman, so that she can sit on her fat little parasitic ass and live off his money, raising her kids in the house that he pays for. The other is a man who is enough of a masculist that he married a FIP woman, FIP equals financially independent person, who has her own career that she enjoys. How will the two divorce experiences of these two men differ? In the first case, that of the manslave, his ex-wife is a fluffy, that is, a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a man. Now that she is divorcing, she is feeling very threatened. She is thinking that, quote, if I don't financially massacre my ex-husband, I might lose my kids and end up penniless and without a roof over my head. Oh, horrors! End quote. So she drags him through the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce court system and financially massacres him, taking advantage of the anti-male bias of the divorce courts set up in the 70s by the fluffy feminist hypocrites. She ends up with his house and half his possessions. She gets sole custody of the kids and child support from him. And since she is a real fluffy, she gets paid alimony from him for the rest of her life. He feels as though he has been hit by a truck. He is made poor. He's now living in his car. He can barely afford to feed himself, let alone have vacations. He has lost his kids, his house, most of his possessions and his savings. He is devastated, depressed, and more than once contemplates suicide, feeling that his life has been destroyed, which it has. The second divorcing father fares much better. He is a partial masculist who had enough sense to marry a FIP woman, an upper middle class woman who studied a profession or a STEM field and makes good money. She has her own career. They discuss the divorce and come to an agreement. There will be no lawyers to leech money from them both. The woman agrees to joint custody because she likes her career and does not relish being a female careerist and a single mother with full custody of the kids. She does not want to be a stay-at-home fluffy, living off the money of her ex-husband, getting child support, the house and half his possessions. She likes her career and wants to continue it, so it will be a relief for her to have the kids only half-time. So they sell the house that they both paid for equally earlier in the marriage and split the profit or loss. There's no alimony because the FIP ex-wife continues her career. Thus the ex-husband is spared the expense of the first guy by not having to pay lawyer fees, does not lose his kids, that is, he gets to keep them half-time, keeps his half of the money from the house, doesn't pay child support to his ex-wife because he has joint custody, and doesn't pay alimony because his ex-wife is a FIP. It's obvious that the second guy is hugely better off than the first dumb fuck. Let us now assume that the two of these guys meet at a business conference at the bar and start talking. Soon the topic gets round to their 2 divorces and they swap war stories. The first guy becomes highly conscious that the second guy is hugely better off than he is, which really gets to him. He becomes very upset and emotional, thinking, "My God, there's a much better way of doing things than the conventional path I took, almost blindly, because it was simply the custom. I did it mostly out of habit, unquestioningly, blindly. My God!" The second guy starts telling the first guy about the core ideas of the Masculists. That is, that women have a moral obligation to be FIPs or be punished by men by being forced to rot on the shelf. That the divorce courts must be menfaired because one married father in 4 gets financially massacred in them. That men should punish fluffies for being immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin to be wiped out. The first guy, the former manslave, starts Googling and YouTubing like crazy, watching MGTOW and Masculist videos, changing the way he sees the world. His former depression and suicidal thoughts about his divorced state of being turns into rage, into hatred for the traditional system. He decides to do something to change it by taking a can of red paint and painting a slogan on his family court building. Quote, "Crime scene against men." Unfortunately, he was seen on the security cameras and reported to the police, who came to his car a few days later and arrested him. At his trial, he tried to explain to the judge, who was a woman and a feminazi, that he had recently converted to being a MGTOW and a masculist. He explained the hatred he felt towards the feminazis and what they had done to him, financially massacring him and destroying his life. He became very emotional and hateful. The feminazi judge eventually condemned him to a year in prison for contempt of court and threatening a judge. During that year in prison, he was raped several times by big Negroes, which made him only more bitter and hateful. When he got out, he had made up his mind to kill the divorce judge, a feminazi woman who had destroyed his life. He knew who she was, found her address, and spied on her habits. He then stabbed her to death one evening as she returned home from the court. He then sent a press release to the newspapers and television, but no one took up his story. This made him feel all the more bitter that the world was against him. He was arrested and given a life sentence and lived unhappily ever after. New section. From the above 2 accounts, you can see why the Masculists place such enormous emphasis on 2 things, namely 1, that fluffies must convert themselves into FIPs, or they are punished by not getting a man, and 2, that the gender laws have to be menfaired, so that millions of men do not have to face what the first guy went through that destroyed his life. If he had been socialized to behave as the second guy did, then his life would have been very different. The story of the first guy, although a bit extreme, is not so unusual. In the US, tens of millions of men have been financially massacred by the hated feminazi, fluffy feminist hypocrite dominated divorce courts. Tens of millions of them. This casualty rate is far worse than in a major war. Until fairly recently, Men who had this happen to them saw it as bad luck, that it was just part of life, that men paid for women to have babies and stay at home raising them. But the contraceptive pill changed all that. Its reliability meant that women could choose the number of kids they wanted, which was typically 0, 1 or 2, so that women had a career window of some 40 years. Then in the 80s, Masculism appeared and started telling men, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work, because anything else is parasitism off the labour of men." End quote. Quote, "Fluffies, that is, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money of a man, must become fips or be punished by men by not getting one." End quote. Quote, "Fluffies are immoral, parasitic, man-slaving vermin to be wiped out." End quote. As the masculist message spreads, now that one married father in 4 is financially massacred in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts, millions of men will become masculists in their mentality and see the divorce courts as crime scenes, as objects to be hated, to be wiped out. When millions of men become full of hatred against these divorce courts, they will be far more likely to take the law into their own hands and murder feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers for the massive crimes the latter are committing in favour of fluffies. These murderously hateful men will convert their former resignation of being victims of their fluffy ex-wives to becoming politically active masculists and see the divorce courts as war zones where the hated feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers are seen as the enemy in the sex war, who need to be killed so that tens of millions of more men are not sacrificed at the fluffy feminist altar. This scenario got me wondering, just how many such divorce court judge and lawyer murders are there in the US each year? I started Googling and came up with the following observations, namely 3 of them. The first is that there was no clear statistic as far as I could discover. The second is that the probable reason for the first observation is that the divorce court judges and lawyers do not want such a statistic to be given to the public, because it would probably inspire more financially massacred ex-husbands to murder more divorce court judges and lawyers. The third was the most interesting, given the second. It was that when divorce court judges and lawyers get together at conferences and big meetings, the topic of security often comes up. I have read on the internet that divorce lawyers talk about incidents that have occurred each year in nearly every city in the US. That made my ears prick up. From that remark, I can guesstimate the number of divorce court judge and lawyer murders there are each year in the US. I wondered whether it would be hundreds or thousands. Here is my calculation. Let's assume that the above remark, quote, "incidents that have occurred each year in nearly every city in the US," end quote, is roughly true. Then how many murders is that? Let's assume that there is at least one such murder per city per year. So how many cities does the US have? Define a city to be a town with a population over 100,000 people. So Googling the question, quote, "how many cities with populations over 100,000 does the US have?" gave the result about 300. So that's hundreds of such murders per year. If that guesstimate is ballpark, then no wonder divorce judges and lawyers are worried about it. No wonder they are afraid. From the masculinist point of view, these hated feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers deserve to be scared. What they are doing is committing a massive crime. They have destroyed the lives of tens of millions of males over the past few decades. They have to be stopped. The divorce laws themselves are the problem, because the divorce laws are not on the side of men. They were set up by feminazis in the 70s to strongly benefit women at the expense of men, in capital letters. With masculinist ideas now spreading widely amongst men, divorcing men are no longer prepared to passively accept being financially massacred. There's an alternative now, that is the type of divorce that the second guy above had, who suffered hugely less than the first guy. Masculist men who are financially massacred in the feminazi divorce courts do not resign themselves to their fate. They are enraged and powerfully motivated to change the divorce laws to make them menfaired. Feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers will therefore more likely be murdered in much greater numbers in the coming years, as divorced men absorb masculist ideas and expectations. As this happens, the murder rate of these hated feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers will probably climb from hundreds per year in the US to thousands per year. As this happens, the sex war against the hated feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers will come to public notice, as it must if thousands, that is not hundreds, of them are murdered each year. Society will see them more as genociders, since they are destroying the lives of tens of millions of men. This murder rate needs to be brought to public attention and discussed so that these massive crimes committed against divorced men are stopped. These masculist-oriented murderers of feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers are merely defending themselves and their fellow men. After all, they are only murdering thousands in the sex war. The feminazis have already murdered, that is, financially massacred and destroyed the lives of tens of millions of men in the US. There's no comparison. These divorce court feminazis have to be stopped. If the divorce laws are not menfaired, then the sex war will only escalate, and more feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers will be murdered. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Prof. Hugo de Garis at yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channels De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers, and De Garis Essays.